men need to adapt to the times. And that doesn't mean vacuum at home more.
It's very hard to describe the steps to have a good marriage.
Family is more important than kids and soccer, even more important than baseball.
So let me paint two versions of a Saturday. In one, a bunch of children are running around the neighborhood or playing a mildly chaotic game of baseball, and no one much cares about the score. No one's compiling highlight reels or Instagram feeds for college coaches. I mean, sure, the parents are nearby, but mostly they're talking to each other. They're maybe grilling something, like casually keeping an eye out for blood. In the other version, the family wakes up before dawn, loads several $100s worth of sports equipment into the car, and drives 2 hours to a travel tournament. The parents spend the day schlepping between games, tracking stats, and wondering whether missing next weekend's tournament will somehow derail their child's future. That second version is increasingly what we think good parenting looks like for some reason, even though almost everyone involved seems to hate it. We've taken something that was always hard, raising children, and added even more layers of anxiety and expense and expectation. Parents are supposed to optimize every single hour of childhood, while also working as if they didn't have children at all. And that's assuming they managed to become parents in the first place. Because before the travel teams and the childcare bills, you have to find someone who wants the same kind of life at roughly the same time. You may feel you need to establish a career, pay off your debt, and buy a house before you can get married. But of course, you also need to be emotionally ready and, heal all your childhood trauma before bringing a child into this scary, scary world. And by the time everything's finally in place, if it ever is, you may discover you waited too long. If enough people feel this way, and increasingly enough people do seem to feel this way, we are in trouble as a country. Birth rates are falling, and there's no obvious sign that the trend will correct itself. So, how did we make marriage and parenthood this hard, and what would it take to make America genuinely family-friendly again? My guest today has some answers. I'm joined by Tim Carney, who is a political columnist of the Washington Examiner and a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And he's also the author of Family Unfriendly. Tim argues that America's baby bust is partly economic, but ultimately cultural. We've elevated autonomy, professional achievement, and intensive parenting in ways that make family life so much harder and so much less appealing than it should be. So I want to know, how do we fix this and make marriage and parenthood feel accessible again? Tim, welcome to the show.
So on paper, you and I are in some ways very similar. We're both libertarian. We're both Catholic. Do you still identify as a libertarian? I should ask.
I'm libertarian-ish.
Libertarian-ish. I think that's actually how I identify too. So in other ways, we could not be more different. You are a father of 6. And your wife, Katie, who is a friend of mine, she stays home with the kids, whereas I am the stereotypical married, no kids, professional with 2 dogs at home.
Are you a girl boss?
I wouldn't call myself a girl boss at the age of 53,
No.
but your book is kind of a brief for your way of life over mine. And I thought that would produce some interesting tensions. So I think we're in for a pretty fun discussion. And I'm just going to start by, let's walk through, the liberal story about why childbearing and family formation is declining, right? We used to have this patriarchy. It forced women into the home. They couldn't do anything except have babies. And then we got women's liberation. Women are able to go out and work while children are also great. Feminists are not like all child-hating, zero PG people. That the main factors in this are, one, we increased women's opportunity, but 2, then there's 2 bad parts, which is that men didn't step up at home, and the government and companies didn't step up. And so we don't have paid family leave, we don't have subsidized childcare, and so forth. That's pretty much the classic story you were going to read on most establishment commentators. So tell me what's wrong with that story.
I mean, it's more overly simplistic than wrong. And that's the thing. I've been talking about birth rate now for a few years, and everybody says, well, it's simple. And there's 32 different, it's simple. It's simple. The youngins are just too selfish. It's simple. The boomers aren't helping out. It's simple. Nobody can afford it. It's not just simple. And so a lot of what you talk about there really is true and contributing. And I'll even go a little bit further. One of the most common sort of liberal stories of this is what I call the happy planning story. And this is also overly simplistic, but it was, oh, well, people are still having babies. It's just, especially college-educated women and college-educated men are waiting till later, maybe 30, to get married. Then they have their kids in their 30s, mid-30s, late 30s, and they end up with just as many children. And especially with the miracle of modern reproductive medicine, they can achieve the family size. That part of the liberal story is factually unwinding at the moment.
Right. It looks like it was true kind of into late Gen X.
Yes.
And then we've now pushed so far that it is not plausible that women are going to start having like a zillion babies in their 40s.
The birth rate for women in their 30s in America is falling. And so that to me shows that happy planning story isn't actually panning out. And I mean, part of it, they even argue that the birth rate, the total fertility rate, the measure of children per women over their lifetime, that was actually not as low as it was because it was just a shift till later. That's sort of a statistical anomaly. All of that is sort of falling apart. It's true that so mothers today are happier than they were 50 years ago. One of the reasons that is because 50 years ago, there were more women who were sort of defaulting into marriage and motherhood when what they would have wanted, maybe some doors were closed by the patriarchy, yada, yada. But it's also true that right now, especially if you look at millennials, they want more marriage and babies than they're having.
Right.
So there is a shortfall. Whether that is true of Gen Z, I don't know, because as the birth rate falls, the image of the life of being married with kids in the suburbs, that starts to fade away. But anyway, the millennials still are getting less marriage and family than they want. How much does that have to do with like the lack of paid maternity leave? How much does it have to do with, the lack of the government stepping in and the way that Sweden's stepping in? The fact is that most of this is not economic. Economics doesn't explain it. There were little baby bumps in some of the Nordic countries when they instituted some of these generous family policies, and then those basically faded away. If you want this to be about economics, and it is about economics in one way, and it used to be a small way, but now it's a big way, the cost of owning a home. Americans want to at least think that that's attainable. You don't want to. I have a friend, when he was getting married and having kids, I was like, why are you buying a house so soon? He said, there is no category in my wife's mind for family with children that is renting. Like, that doesn't exist. And so that's a very American
much less in an apartment. Like, we both grew up in New York.
Yes.
And raising kids in an apartment, there are downsides to it. There are also a lot of upsides. But it just seems to blow people's mind, the idea that you could have a kid in an apartment.
Yeah. And it was lame. Like, I wanted to play Nerf basketball in my hallway, but we had downstairs neighbors and we couldn't do it. So anyway,
we had a playroom in our building, my friends and I just ran around the building. It was a little self-contained community.
That's family friendly.
Yeah, it was family friendly. It was great.
And so yes, culture should be more family friendly. Workplaces should be more family friendly. The federal government should probably do a little bit more, not a lot more, to help with this. But the real reason birth rates are falling are ultimately, I think, cultural, that we've changed our values, that we have changed our anthropology. We change how we think about ourselves in ways that themselves, I think, are negative.
All right, so let's tell the conservative story, right? So the conservative story is that culture isn't, to some extent, a coordination problem, right? It's not enough for me to want to get married and have kids. There has to be a guy out there who wants to get married and have kids. And we need to be doing that at roughly the same time. We need to find each other. There needs to be a lot of cultural support to solve that coordination problem.
Or just a really good app. I didn't mean to interrupt, but that's exactly the idea of the app, of the dating apps, was to remove that friction.
But this is the conservative argument would be,
sorry.
It's not enough to remove the friction because it's not just a friction problem, right? It's not just a problem of finding someone. Yes. It's that you find someone and they're perfect in 85% of ways. But if you're on the app, you're just they're perfect in 95% of ways. But what if Mr. 98% is out there and you keep searching? And that social pressure to settle down, get married and have kids played an actual really important role in this. That, your mother is go out with him anyway. You might have nice friends, was my mother's go to. And that social pressure as it's abated, right? And the social pressure to have kids, and that as long as the workplace is seen as higher status for women, or even as high status for women, you're going to lose a lot of people who net would have been happier And that it's actually just better if we make it normative that women are home and raising kids, and normative that you get married young, and normative that we don't have sex outside of marriage. And that if you allow those norms to fade away, that it's just inevitably going to break and we're going to end up where we are now. What is wrong with that story?
The main problem with that story is that you can't turn back the clock.
Well, that there were a lot of people
and there
who
were
very
a lot
unhappy.
of people who were very
Right.
unhappy. As you know, the average stay-at-home mom was significantly less happy in, especially 1970 than today. It's the same story I used to tell about sort of the white guy outside of Pittsburgh in 1955 who was thriving, and why can't we get that? Because he didn't have to compete for the factory job on even terms with black people or women. He wasn't really competing with would-be immigrants, wasn't really competing with China or Europe because they couldn't. And so you had sort of this protected status, and that's what was great. And
Right.
so men losing some of the protected status, and this is sort of the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez argument about following marriage rights, is that bad men used to be able to get married because for women this was an opportunity. So this was a rare opportunity to get an established life. So my counter argument, if a conservative makes that argument, is well, men need to adapt to the times. And that doesn't mean vacuum at home more. I think men need to step up as dads. So there was this one study I point to in my book about a workplace where they were like, why aren't the women being promoted? But then one of the lines from a woman in the company was like, I have to admit that if I see a woman leaving work at 6, which was early, at 6, I assume she's going to spend time with her family. Well, if the man's leaving at 6, I assume he's going to a client meeting. So her implication was she was sort of accusing the woman of shirking. And my response is, if the woman is really going to spend time with her family and the male employee is going to have drinks with the client, then the woman's doing the right thing. So I advocate what I call a sort of a pronatal feminism, which would be men being dads, owning it, and stepping up in the workplace and being like, by the way, I'm leaving at 5 because I'm going to go make dinner for my family. So the main problem is guys who want to turn it back, conservatives who want to go back to another time. A lot of that wasn't fair. A lot of that's not realistic. And what you are going to have to do more dadding than your baby boomer dad did.
You had such a great bit on the mom-fluencers. And I think, but there's also the manosphere. And I think people on both sides, it's like this fantasy world where, I'm in charge.
Yeah.
I come home from a hard day and there is my wife looking glamorous and perfect, having cleaned the house to sparkling, and all of the well-groomed children lining up to sing a song of Welcome to Daddy. Is that your experience? All the children just lined up in a neat row?
And perfectly groomed.
Yeah.
No, I mean, so I think that also you mentioned the manosphere and the social media. These do this problem of setting unreasonable expectations. And if we're going to talk about sort of right-wing problems, I talked to some sort of based 20-somethings, and they think they don't want what so many of us Gen X dads have, but they really do. If they got to spend a Sunday, you wake up, you take your not perfectly groomed kids to mass, you meet up with the neighbors, you grill, you have beer while your kids run around and the wives are all chatting and the guys are all talking. That's the good life. It may not be Bronze Age enough for some guys, or it may not be 1950 enough for some guys, but that really is the good life, and that really is attainable.
It struck me. I assume you have read the Narnia books to your children.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a line in the last book that talks about, for listeners who are not familiar, for the three of you who have not read the Narnia books, the core characters are 4 children who appear in The Lion, the Witch, the Wardrobe. We follow their adventures through the last battle, for those who are not familiar with the book. But there's a line in it about the one girl who has been in the series who doesn't show up because she's like 18 now. And someone describes her as having rushed to get to the stupidest age of life and then wanting to spend as long as possible there. Look, I have very fond memories of being in my 20s and even my early 30s because I married late. But it's not a phase of life I want to spend the rest of my life in. Mm-hmm. It was fun. And there's an element of valorizing the phase of life when you are the most self-centered and you are the most self-absorbed. And what I see of people who've managed to do that, there's a fair number of them, especially in cities, and we both grew up in a city, is like they're really sad by their 50s.
Well, I do think it's probably a healthy phase for 18 and 19-year-olds. And I think it's fine. And I see lots of, college kids go through this individuation process, and it's good. And but I think it ought to be a phase. I think our culture is stuck in that phase. You read some of the stuff either in favor of divorce or against marriage on some of our op-ed pages in this country, or like Susie Orman, the personal finance advisor. She says nobody should have any joint accounts at all. Her argument is you came into this marriage an autonomous person. You need to stay an autonomous person. And you see how that's contrary to a lot of the idea of marriage, a lot of the idea of family, a lot of the idea of community. And so that sort of holding on to your autonomy as if it's the most important thing, that I think, again, what's natural for a 19-year-old, phase they should pass through, I think it's become increasingly our culture, especially our elite college-educated culture.
So what would the ideal family-friendly society, like, sketch out for me?
Yes.
Typical Tuesday in Carney land.
One is we just broadly as a culture take a side in favor of family, marriage, and having kids. Not that everybody has to do it. We're Catholics. All of our favorite priests are unmarried and have no kids.
Yes.
And so not everybody is called to marriage and family formation. But you used the word normative earlier. Sometimes it seemed to be a bad thing. It's like a negative suffix in some woke parlance. Oh, you're going to be heteronormative. This, I think normative and tolerant at the same time is often the sweet spot. So like, the normal thing to do is to finish whatever schooling you're going to do, get a job, get married, and have kids. And we are going to accommodate that. We are going to sort of point as a society towards that. And does that make it a little easy to fall into shaming or ostracizing people who don't do it? Yes, so we have to be on guard against that. Guess what? There is no perfect world without tension. So that's the first thing, is that we just make it clear, like, bring us kids. We're going to make it easier if you show up at our restaurant with kids. Now, fancy restaurant, 8 p.m., if I'm there with my wife, I'm there to get away from my kids. So I'm all for adult-only spaces too. But, the airports in Spain and lots of Europe will be like, you get to cut the line if you have a kid. Why? Not because you're like a higher caliber citizen, but because you need to, okay?
Isn't that true? I mean, when I fly American Airlines, they're always, I don't know how it is.
No, I mean the security line or the taxi line, not just the getting on board line. So just lots of little accommodations. I think, again, workplaces would also try to accommodate it. One thing we did at one point in the Examiner, there's a woman, she got married, and she basically made it clear. She's like, I want to have a kid as soon as possible. So we moved her from being a writer to editing the outside contributors, because that's inherently sort of asynchronous and remote. And so workplaces lining up jobs, schools saying, okay, by the way, this sort of job is more family friendly than this sort of job. I mean, nursing is just this amazing thing where, like, I want to work 5 hours a week. You do it. I want to work 80 hours a week. Snap your fingers. You have those 80 hours. That doesn't exist in every field. So, like, all of culture sort of pointing towards people need to get married and have kids, or we all, society dies off. Not everybody needs to do that.
But I am in complete agreement that
not everybody needs to do it, but we need to accommodate it. We need to try to make it easier.
Is there, though, a way to do it without shame? Last year in the Dispatch, I wrote a piece on discovering that my mom had a baby before I was born.
I read that.
And gave it up for adoption. So on the one hand, what we discovered is that, like, look, there was a tremendous cost to stigmatizing out of wedlock sex, right? A tremendous, tremendous burden. And in some ways, I understood at the end of my mother's life how much that moment, that 9 months, had scarred her permanently. And at the same time, I'm not sure there is a way to maintain norms about people getting married before they have sex without that kind of stigma, right? I'm not sure there is a happy medium. And maybe there's not a happy medium on this. Maybe it has to be that there is a real emotional cost to both men and women if they fail to get married, and that then has downsides that maybe we're not willing to bear.
So I think this is a real big question. I'll address the bigger stuff first and then the specific stuff. A lot of people say what we need more of, especially a conservative with libertarian leanings, we need more shame or stigma in culture. What your story really drove home when I read that in Dispatch is actually the stigma and the suffering is bad, but maybe bad in a way like, an amputation is bad. Sometimes it's necessary. We shouldn't celebrate. We shouldn't say, "Oh, good, there's shame going on here." It's a bad thing. And I think that some of the problems of the modern world are looking at stuff like the suffering that you described beautifully in that piece and saying, we can get rid of that suffering if we just change our norms. And that's a reasonable impulse. And I think that it often proves to be a mistake.
I think that's right. And yet, look, I look at I love old movies. I love old television shows. I have a thing for kind of mid-century kitsch. And the thing that strikes me about that culture is that on the one hand, it is pronatal in a way that I view, despite the fact that I am childless, as fundamentally healthy in presenting that as normative. Because I think probably first of all, we need more people. People are good. But at the same time, it is also true that it's endless jokes about the old maid and about the desperation to not be an old maid. And we've gone too far, I think, in the other direction, where it's seen as vaguely weird to actually really desperately want to get married. Of course, you should really desperately want to get married.
In elite circles, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, being married is amazing. Being married is it's also really hard and all that. I mean, I know that no one on this podcast has ever had a fight with their spouse or realized that there were real difficult, grueling compromises that would have to be made.
Do you think single women in the United States get bombarded either by media or community or whatever, constantly saying, "Why are you not married yet? Why?"
No, I think it's the opposite.
Yeah.
It's why would you get married at 23? That's weird. Why would you do that? That's weird. Optimal age to get married, by the way, is 25. That's when that is when basically if you get married between 20 and 25, your risk of divorce does go up. But after that, it doesn't.
So the error people make is you should have your life and career in order before you get married.
Yes,
I think
the
that's a
capstone version of marriage.
I use a football thing. It should be your draft day, not your Hall of Fame. If you think you've done all the work on you that you need to, then you're not going to meld together with the other person. But I would say, when's too early to get married? When you're not yet mature enough to understand sacrificial love. That's the answer. When are you ready to get married? When you actually think, I'm going to lay down my life for this other person.
It is really difficult to create a cultural script for that because that is the flip side of it is that you have a lot of people who are desperate to get married and this person will do. So I agree with you. I think the capstone model of marriage is bad. I got married at 37. I'm on no high moral ground here. Sometimes you get to wait. My husband also is younger than me. So
you're pointing to part of the reason that this is people avoid talking about this. And some people think I'm weird. Why do you care if other people get married and have kids? Part of the reason is there's a lot of people who wanted to get married young and didn't, and then they can hear from the culture, or maybe from some specific people saying this, it's because you valued career over family. And
yeah, I find that stereotype really unhelpful. And the thing is that both sides contribute to it, right? Look, I got married at 37 because I didn't meet someone. I really wanted to get married. I am not ashamed to say it because being married is awesome, but it was very important to me. Mm-hmm. And I spent my late 20s and early 30s in a long-term relationship that didn't work out. So I got married at 37 because that was when I met someone I wanted to marry. And it turned out that he was the best possible person to marry, luckily for me. But a lot of women who find themselves 35, whatever, they'll be I was spending too much time building my career. And I don't actually think that's true. Mm-hmm. I think in almost all cases, that is the cope. Because it feels so terrible to be I didn't find someone who wanted to marry me.
You and I have done hundreds of podcasts about stuff, and often you're talking about a war with Iran or something that's clearly a policy issue, and here we're talking about how one loves one's spouse. So this is kind of weirdly personal in some way, and that's one reason why, if we're doing it on a policy level, I'm writing op-eds for the Washington Examiner or doing stuff for the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research. What is some viewer out there thinking, what does my dating life have to do with public policy research? And to some extent, it has to do with policy, but a lot of it, it's just culture is a thing that matters. And when we ignore it because it's all just individuals' choices, I think we fail to provide guidance for the next generation. That's a huge thing that culture does, is guide people towards what's good for them without having to prove to them that it's good to them. So that's some of the norms of get married relatively young and have kids. Our kids all see an image of basically suburban dads coaching Little League on Saturday and the family going to mass on Sunday and having a family dinner with the extended family. And they say, okay, so this is a normal, fun thing where we find meaning in life and connection and that stuff. That's what a culture does. And it teaches in a way that no explicit lesson can do. And I think that our culture, to be pluralistic, to be welcoming, to be tolerant, sometimes goes too far. And it's just like, well, the world is whatever you make it go. But then the implicit message in there is like, well, you should succeed academically and professionally. That you definitely have to do.
Well, in part because I can describe how you do that.
Yes.
Right? Like, it's very hard to describe the steps to have a good marriage, which is why there's like a zillion self-help books on it, because it's so intense and personal. We should get back to policy and to thinking about sort of the larger questions. But here is one thing that I think we have to address when we're talking about both the making marriage and family normative, but also about more broadly making things like making it possible for people to stay home with their kids normative, right? There's a real big cost to that. In our economy, there are returns to work. Not in every profession, as you say, nursing is a good one where you can go and pick it up and drop it and keep going in and out. And it's very, not coincidentally, it's a profession that's mostly women, and it has some accommodation. It offers a lot of flexibility for those women, in part because there's a nursing shortage. But a lot of jobs aren't like that. Mm-hmm. And if you step back, right, you and me, we both do the same thing. Realistically, if we had taken 10 or 20 years off to raise kids, we would not be as good at our jobs.
Correct.
We just would not have the experience and so forth. And there's no way you can compensate with stuff that you learned. But like ultimately, there's just very high returns to investment in these jobs, especially in those first 20 years.
Well, and being in person, even for you and I who have the ability to work remote most of the time, seeing your editors, talking, meeting your sources, all of those things are incredibly valuable. That's why Claudia Golden's study from last decade really helped form my whole thought on the sort of work-parenthood balance. Was what she found was that the pay gap, and I might be overstating this a little bit, but the pay gap between men and women by 2015 was entirely due to the fact that mothers wanted flexibility in when and where they did their work.
And really importantly is that this is not just an arbitrary thing that firms do, right? Like, say you got high-priced attorneys, right? They're billing by the hour, so it seems like in theory you could just take one 80-hour-a-week job and split it into two. But in fact, then you end up with massive coordination costs of trying to pass stuff up. The clients want to be able to talk to the person who did the thing at any hour, and that in fact these jobs really aren't splittable. They just they display increasing returns to hours.
And so I do think, though, that the modern economy can provide, especially if employers think about it, more jobs that are more family-friendly in that they can be flexible in when and where the work is done. Secondly, I just think if every mom in America got to snap their fingers and have the job setup they want, there'd be a massive movement, not towards full stay-at-home moms. That's right. My wife, full-time stay-at-home mom, that's what she wants to be doing. That's not, in fact, the majority opinion of moms. It's part-time job where you're there when the school bus picks your kid up and you're there when the school bus drops your kid off. That's what the plurality of moms want, and there would be a massive movement towards that, and there's not that many doing that. So that's sort of how the economy kind of needs to change. Some of that could be deregulating. The difference between full-time and part-time is heavily regulated to prevent that exploitation, but it can make it hard to be like...
Right. So, for example... one of the reasons colleges, when we had Tyler Austin Harper on in a recent episode, and he was talking about the fact that colleges have pushed a lot of their faculty into adjunct roles. And not only have they pushed the faculty into adjunct roles that don't have tenure, don't have the same job protections, don't pay as well, and are often teaching more classes and doing less research, but also because of Obamacare. Because Obamacare requires you to provide health care, health insurance, if you work more than, is it 20 or 30 hours a week? I don't remember the number.
Once you become officially full-time by their
Right.
measure, they have to give you
They have to give you health insurance, and health insurance is incredibly expensive. It's essentially adding like $10,000, $20,000 onto someone's paycheck. And so basically these colleges limit how many hours you can work as an adjunct for them, which means that these adjuncts then have to string together 3 or 4 adjunct jobs, and they're like on the highway all the time, right? So there are ways in which regulation makes this harder. But I think if you talk to the companies, they would say like, look, you had a lot of suggestions, and I am like, I am emotionally sympathetic to these suggestions for how workplaces could be friendlier. That's, you know, what you did with the editor who wants to have kids is great when that's possible. A lot of companies would say like, look, we're in a really competitive marketplace. We cannot afford to give people all this leave. We can't afford to hold positions open for people who may or may not come back. We can't afford to do all of these things. And one question I had while I was reading is like, look, maybe the easiest way to get this is to have more crony cabinet, to be more like Europe, not just, you know, government programs, but more cronyism, more straight government protection of incumbents, so they have monopoly rents they can distribute to their workers, more government regulations to hold, you know, like give people all of these rights when they're. What's wrong with that story?
So
how do you square that circle?
For one thing, when you require like, this is what you need to do for employees who have kids, then job applicants who have kids become less desirable.
Right.
Women and maternity leave, that's been proven by economists.
And while you can then make it illegal to do that, it's actually incredibly difficult to prove.
I actually think, I mean, married dads and probably married moms are the best employees. Like they show up. Wait, you're giving me health insurance? I'm going to do everything I can to not lose this job if it's covering my wife and my kids or covering.
No, like I think that this is empirically correct. However, causation, Tim, is this selection bias or is this
both?
Actually...
But if you can keep married men on staff, then you're keeping reliable workers who are going to bust their butt. So part of my argument to an employer is you should want to have moms and dads as your employees, not to discriminate against non-moms and non-dads, but if you do a little extra accommodation, which some people would argue is discrimination, I think that will help the company up to a certain limit, right?
And some of this is a no-brainer. Like, don't stick women in like a broom closet to nurse.
Oh, the nursing room. It's like we have this room that doesn't have air conditioning. And so the accommodation question is tricky because, again, we value sort of liberalism, pluralism, neutrality. Do you remember when Elizabeth Warren said she was fired for being pregnant? And we don't exactly know if that happened, but there was at the Examiner opinion page, we always would just debate everything. And this one guy was like, well, why shouldn't you be allowed to fire somebody for being pregnant if she's going to miss some work? Isn't that like a legit, like very hardcore capitalist thing? And I just said, well, you shouldn't do it. Like, you should be pro-family.
One of the, like, while I do still identify as a libertarian, I love all of my libertarian compatriots. I mean, one thing that I think that some libertarians underestimate is the ways in which markets do have a lot of norms about and values kind of embedded in them to work well, right?
Well, and so to some extent, yeah, I think you're right to say that this is something that some libertarians need to understand more. And again, lots of libertarians understand this perfectly, but not just where everything's a market, but where everything's a transaction. That's not a healthy society. Social trust, and a lot of people think that this is sort of a made-up idea. I think it really matters. And I think that, again, to go back to family, people trust moms and dads more, and moms and dads are put in more positions where they just have to rely on trust more. And so a society where we are more all individuals with less marriage, fewer kids, is going to be a society with less trust going on, and that everybody's going to be less happy.
Well, and another thing, and you make this point, I've made this point, but like, is that the whole idea of like, I'll save up for retirement and then I don't need to have kids, is like that works on the individual level and it doesn't work in aggregate. And it doesn't work in aggregate even if you don't expect to get Social Security, right? Regardless of whether you are expecting to live on your Social Security checks, your corporate pension, or your investments, ultimately, that is a claim on stuff produced by younger workers.
Yeah.
And if those younger workers do not exist, then we are in trouble. But like the sort of people who run movements are in general upper middle class people.
Yes.
And there's like a lot of lip service to paying attention to the concerns of working class women. But one of the very specific ways in which I think this shows up, and you kind of hint at this in your book, although you're not as unkind as to say it outright in the way that I now am, is that for someone like me, like women going into the professional world, have been very good for me because I am a huge nerd and I'm not sure I would have been happy raising 6 kids. I love what I do. That said, for the median woman who does not have a really awesome job and does not have the opportunity for enormous success, like the movement ends up so focused on the CEOs, on how many female CEOs there are. It's like there are like 500 Fortune 500 CEOs. This is not the world's biggest social problem, right? It might be a big social problem as it trickles down and reflects on how those companies are run. But that itself, the opportunity to get to be a CEO is actually just not a thing that most people are worried about. And most women who are working much less exciting, interesting, well-paid jobs, they have a lower opportunity cost for staying home. They're probably more interested in doing it. But I could also turn that around. So there's a kind of blindness. There's a kind of like, it just so happens that the things I think are most important are also the things that like are the ones that I personally want to do. But let me turn that around on you, Tim. Do you think you have similar blind spots? When you're like, yes, we've decided that family is more important than your cats and your soccer.
I mean, I think about it every time I say it, and I still think family is more important than kids and soccer, even more important than baseball. And that, do I have blind spots? Yeah, but also, I mean, so one thing is I try to think of where is my experience exceptional. And one is I am raising a family. My wife and I are raising a family embedded in a tight-knit community. Friends, in-laws right around the corner. Katie's sister, who used to babysit our oldest ones when, before she was married and have kids, she's now asking our middle daughter to go down and babysit her. It's like this tight-knit community makes raising kids and makes Katie's job as a stay-at-home mom much more enjoyable, much more bearable, much more doable. It's one reason why I don't gush too much about sort of the joy of parenthood, and I try to talk more about how it's meaningful, it's good for the culture, is because I know that I have such a support network of in-laws, neighbors, parishioners, church, that really...
And you argue in the book that in fact that just matters more.
Yes.
That being closer to your family matters more
than any government support. And so I know that's my privilege, and that if I am preaching get married young and have kids to somebody who is an only child, had to move further away from home, doesn't have that connection with their in-laws, I might be making it sound easier than it is. But why? But so on the question of, I mean, there's data. If you get support when you're raising your first kid, when the dad chips in on actually taking care of the baby, that helps the mother's mental health and makes them more likely to have a second kid. When the mom has access to her own parents, her in-laws, her siblings, that helps her mental health and makes it more likely for her to have baby number 2. When mom has access to basically totally paid for zero-cost childcare, that doesn't seem to make any meaningful difference.
Because she's still got 16 hours alone with the baby.
I think it's because she feels when you're doing it together with a family, you feel like you're part of a bigger undertaking rather than I have to handle this child and I have to handle this job, and these are two conflicting things. Once you're part of a bigger clan doing this, you're doing something big and great. I mean, everybody has done this, where you've done an undertaking that just because it's with a bunch of other people, you feel like it's a grand undertaking.
I think everyone can agree that the current level of intensive parenting is terrible. The people I know who are participating in it hate it. Mm-hmm. Everyone hates it. No one wants to spend their entire life ferrying their children to travel sports or to dance competitions or whatever. And yet they're all doing it. And so one thing that you suggested, one thing that you write about in the book that I really liked is that just this evening t-ball game on Friday nights, where the chief attraction is not that the children are getting in their early preparation for their future major league careers. It's that they're just running around.
Yes.
Like we remember running around, and that doesn't seem to exist in anyone's life in the same way.
It's a lot less common, and you have to seek it out to some extent. There's just sort of also the overscheduling norm, and again, the belief that you have so much control over your children's outcome, which Brian Kaplan in Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, he largely, I don't agree with about a third of that book, but I think the main point is you don't actually really determine how your kids turn out. So stop
or rather,
trying.
you did that determination 9 months before the child was born. You did not have full control over it, and now most of it's pretty set.
And so the intensive parenting, and I call it the travel team trap, precisely because parents get caught in it. We briefly got caught in it because I said it was somewhere between like the D1 scholarship and the living vicariously, but less conscious. And just somebody's like, your kid's like, he hasn't played select ball. He's good enough. He should do that. And
This is
baseball. And so it just like filled me with such pride. And he goes off and he does this. And we realize it's a mistake. Their first winter workout, like little league kids should not be having January indoor workouts. The first winter workout, the coach says, baseball isn't fun. Winning baseball is fun. To 11 and 12-year-olds. And later, Katie was like, this is a mistake. I said, but every bad thing that happens to Charlie is good material for my book. So that was our compensation. And we pulled ourselves out of that trap, and we built leagues. You talked about the T-ball for the little kids. That was not a feeder program to some little league team. That was something for all the families to get together on a Friday night to do. We built teams. I said, we're not going to practice. Your kids are practicing middle school age, like they get practice in gym. We're going to show up, and we're going to play baseball every Wednesday night and every Saturday morning. That team was fully subscribed by parents who were like, I didn't know this existed. But then you see the local Little League gets a little worse because the pitchers are all pitching in travel ball. And in baseball, if you have kids who can't find the strike zone, it's the worst sport in the world.
I think this is something of a delusion. I don't know, maybe it helps some kids get scholarships on the margin, but in general, it won't. Like most kids are not getting scholarships.
I think it's a norm. I think they do it because they think that's what they're supposed to do for their kids.
But here's the thing, like, I don't know about you. I wrote my first novel when I was 8. I mean, it was not very good. It was in a composition book. It involved a girl named Janie riding a school bus. But the thing is, like, if you really want it, if you're the sort of person that really is going to want it that bad, those kids are going to do it. Those kids are going to be begging you to do select ball. Those kids are going to be begging to like go.
Well,
the kids who don't, and they should enjoy playing on teams. Right?
I would go a little further, and I would say that I think that the kids who want to play baseball year-round, parents should treat that like the kids who want to. If your kid was like, I want to lift weights all the time at 10, you would say no. If your kid's like, I want to just do nothing but creatine and protein maxing, you would say no. And I think that you need to force your kids to mix it up. There will be some kid who, through raw talent, and after he goes through puberty, is going to be better than your son, no matter how many hours you put in. So you should just try to make it enjoyable. And more importantly, try to make it fit within your family. Like there's, next level softball. No, don't do next level softball. Do next door softball. Yeah. But also just, talking about the anxiety, if every activity is for the sake of the resume or some higher accomplishment rather than for the sake of itself, then childhood becomes a lot less enjoyable and parenthood becomes a lot less enjoyable. I was talking to 2 quick stories from music teachers. One was this woman who, when she was asked by some like local TV station, she taught inner city schools, inner city kids here in DC and New York band. She was asked, is your dream to see, one of your trumpet players on stage at the Kennedy Center? And she sort of laughed and she said, can I tell you about my favorite student? And she told the story about a guy who was like currently a park ranger. He had played piano, but now he was like also doing like ballroom dance. I don't know what it was, like upstate New York resorts that still existed or something. And just like she would write him about what he had discovered about geology. She was his music teacher who taught him to love learning. And she used the adjective expansive. Like that's what his life was constantly learning new stuff. And I thought that's what childhood should be, is expansive and not intensive. And there was this one violin teacher I spoke to in Pennsylvania, and she said one day she was with a student, and she was like, "Oh, so what's going on in your life?" And the student said, "Well, I'm hearing from whether or not I get into UPenn this weekend. So today might be my last lesson." Meaning the only reason this girl had practiced violin for 4 years was to put it on her resume to get into college.
That's really sad.
And you just think people who and this woman who just loved music so much, it was like a dagger in her heart.
Yeah, I think we used to have a sense that, like, you go back and look at movies, kids' movies, like The Bad News Bears, or whatever, right? There's a sense that stakes are very high, but they're kid stakes. That you should be in a world, right, where the stakes are intense about whether I learn, like whether I get the part in the play or whatever. But they also don't. They don't matter for your future. It doesn't matter whether you got that part of the play. You will always remember it, but it is not going to affect your life. And now we are importing adult stakes into childhood. So, I think this goes to, you kind of argue that natalism is like downstream of eschatology, right? That like we need to have a sense that the future is good.
Yeah.
And if we don't, people aren't going to want to have kids. And you'd see this on the left all the time, right? I can't have kids because of climate change, or I can't have kids because of conflict or systemic racism or whatever it is.
Well, so I've got a sort of complicated story about this, and I was helped by something Ezra Klein wrote in the New York Times about this, where when these people, Miley Cyrus, I quote her in the book, saying, "I'm not going to bring kids into this world unless we live in a world where fish can actually survive in the water," or something. And he says the most, and for some reason this went viral recently on Twitter. It was an article from a few years ago. It says, "The most common question I get is it okay to have kids considering climate change is happening?" And so he said that they'll say, the people who ask this, like, look at these forest fires, the world will be uninhabitable. And he says, it's just not true. If you live in the wealthy world, we're going to adapt. So then Ezra's interpretation is the fear is really a cover story for a guilt, that the wealthy world has poisoned the planet and the rest of the world is going to suffer. And my view is that climate guilt, to the degree it's a real thing, is sort of a totem for a deeper guilt. It's a belief that, like, we're not actually good. And the funny thing is, non-ideological people would say this to me. There's one woman I quote in the book saying, and she kept talking about litter, which was such like a 1990s thing, because she doesn't read all the climate stuff.
Right.
She talked about nuclear warfare and litter, and she said humans are the cancer of the earth. And that's an argument put forward by Warren Hearn, a late-term abortionist. He's written a whole book about how humans should be understood as a cancer on the rest of the earth. And so that deeper idea that we fundamentally aren't good, I think that's hugely behind the baby bust.
I think, let me offer an alternative theory, which is that the fear is a cover for fear, right? But it's not fear of climate change. And that, like, in some ways that we obsess about these things in part because media has a negativity bias. And in the United States and the English-speaking world, that negativity bias has gotten much, much worse over the last 15, 20 years. And so people are getting hyped up on fears that are kind of I'm not saying climate change. I believe in climate change. I think we should do something about it. I support carbon taxes. I support other means. I support scientific research. But that we fixate on those fears because we're also afraid of giving up our autonomy. Mm-hmm. We're afraid of our life changing. We're afraid of realizing that we're not young anymore and that we're not going to live forever.
I think self-doubt is tied up with the fear of giving up your autonomy because you're really going to test whether or not other people like you when you get married. It is possible to go through life, if you work in a big company, you ride on the metro, to avoid really testing whether or not you can love and be loved. And I think that fear of, like, can I really be loved? That's terrifying.
And a totally rational fear that you won't be a good parent, right? I guess I will always have questions. Would I have been a good parent? I don't know. I can see all the ways in which I wouldn't. I can see all of the things about me that would make me. And I think people have that totally rational fear. And they also have a fear, I think, in a lot of ways of making decisions. Right, we all do. I'm not saying like this is special to people, but we have fears of making decisions. It's irrevocable. My mother told me that once she had me, she was looking down at me lovingly, and all of a sudden she thought, "Oh my God, I can't even die for the next 18 years." Right? Like that. This is what Russ Roberts, economist, calls wild problems. That there are certain decisions in life. There is no way to know what they are like until you're on the other side of them. And once you're on the other side of them, there are no backseas. Having kids is one of the biggest of those. Converting to a faith, getting married, that these are, I think, often the problems that cultures are structured to handle by herding people into one set. And now maybe the herding is wrong, right? Like I'm not saying that therefore that cultures are always right about this, but that somehow cultural norms, cultural practices, they are structured to help us negotiate wild problems, because there's no way you can't like just do a ton of SAT prep.
Yeah.
And end up ready for
and
kids.
Somebody says like, how can you, if somebody used a metaphor of like having kids is being on the other side of the lake, how can you convince somebody to do that? How can you convince somebody to pass through this wild threshold? Like I'm an Aristotelian. There's a right amount of norms and individual self-determination, and we are right now erring on the side of too little guidance and too much self-determination.
So I want to talk about how this happens in communities as we try to land this somewhat large and unwieldy but fascinating plane. You live in a pretty thick community, and you talk about other communities where it's just like easy to have kids because everyone has kids, right? These are, and to some extent, collective action problems. And if you live in a neighborhood with a lot of working moms, there's going to be a lot of services for working moms. If you live in a neighborhood with a lot of stay-at-home moms, there's going to be things like coffee hours, like cafes that are open for lunch and have lots of high chairs, and coffee hours where people can go stash the kids in Bible reading at the church and like actually just talk to an adult for a little while. And one possibility is that there are just two equilibria that work. Right. And one is most people home, that a culture guides people towards most women stay home. We can say people, but know in practice it will be mostly women. And the other is I look around and maybe there's no in between.
Well,
maybe there's no stable.
That would be unfortunate, because a lot of people have two incomes and two full-time jobs because that's what they need to do. Yeah. And we just are very far from an economy where most families could afford, if they wanted to have one parent, statistically, mostly the mom, stay at home. And so, yes, every stay-at-home mom makes it easier for the next mom to be a stay-at-home mom. The falling birth rates happen in 100 ways, and you're pointing to some of them. I'm going to turn that to an optimistic thing. That means that anything we can do to sort of nudge more people to get married and have kids, more families to say, you know what? One of us will, if not have zero income, at least be at home throughout the day, throughout the week. That can start a virtuous circle and make it easier for the next person.
I will say that, like, I think that people are starting to wake up to what it means to have a world without kids and a world without so many couples. And what they're realizing is that, well, there are stories of individual liberation, right? I'm not like that. My mom would talk about the unhappy marriages she grew up around. That was real. But that the world is sad. Children are hope. And when the children disappear, the hope disappears too. And I think it's making us sadder as a society. And I think that we've only seen the beginning of that. So I also think that like we should just be better at family formation, because that would be a happier world for everyone, not for literally every single individual. There is no policy that is best for every single individual. That is a mirage, as Thomas Sowell says. There are no solutions, only trade-offs. But there are cultural norms and policies that would be better for a larger number of people than what we have now. But the question is, how do we get there? So the ending question I have, the same question we ask all of our guests, what are you optimistic about?
Well, now people talk about the baby bust. I mean, when you and I were kids, overpopulation was the scare. And then when I first pitched Family Unfriendly, my agent said, who's a bit of a boomer, he said, I still thought overpopulation was a problem. I had my research assistant look it up, but I was shocked that birth rates were low and falling. So I'm optimistic about that. And again, there are across the U.S. all these pockets of families of people getting married in their 20s, having kids, having more kids than they can afford, and raising their kids in a way that is hopefully painting an image of a good life for their neighbors and for their own kids. And this happens. And so I guess I'm optimistic because I think it's contagious. I think family life is contagious. And I guess in that sense, we are the virus. And I think it'll spread.
I also think that people are starting to wake up and that is changing. For the last 50 years, it has been high status to denigrate children, to denigrate marriage as kind of holding women back. And I'm not saying that there's plenty of movies that idealize having children, plenty of influencers and so forth. But that we don't want to say it would be better if you got married than not in most cases. It would be better if you had kids than not in most cases. It's not just that maybe this is one of a bevy of lifetime options. You could have a child. You could take up the loot. And it feels to me in some way like we are on the cusp of a norm shift. Dare I even hope that we are on the cusp of making helicopter parenting low status so that people feel embarrassed when they're hovering over their children. I don't know how we get there. Shame. I'm just saying shame. No, I love all of my parents, including my parent listeners, including my helicopters. No, Tim, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.